I think this lockdown in the UK and indeed across the world gives us a lot of opportunities to reflect on human society and a lot of I guess a lot of issues around that, how we interact with each other, how we I'm not just talking about physical contact, I'm talking about um generally principles like freedom and liberty and so on. Um just to be clear, I support the measures taken. I think it's absolutely essential. And I was totally disgusted by what I heard about some yobs setting fire to Iceland delivery vans in Bristol, in the South Mead neighbourhood of Bristol. I think they should be harshly dealt with because that is absolutely repugnant. It's bad enough any time, but particularly at this time when those vehicles are used for delivering goods to vulnerable people. Um, this came shortly after the Prime Minister's announcement, so presumably it was resentment against that, but it's disgustingly selfish. Another thing that needs to be really challenged is these idiots pushing baseless conspiracy theories. Cardi B, the rapper, I really don't know anything about her. Looking at her, I'm not impressed. Just looking at the sort of rhetoric she comes out with. Um, she has been pushing the false claim that celebrities have been paid to say they've got coronavirus. Idris Elba, made a very reasonable response in which he denounced this as rubbish. Um, that's not only ignorant, it's also callous and it's dangerous because it stirs up hatred against a group of people with no evidence for that. So it sort of sends out this notion, all these rich celebrities are just making it up, they're part of the establishment. Well, an idiot like Cardi B who is doing this really needs to be, I think, shamed for that because it's reckless. Um, it's a bit like the Chinese regime making the false claim that America has created this virus. The Iranian regime has also done that because they won't take responsibility for their own culpability. Now, I take the view that every government and society needs to be judged on its own response to this. So, in that sense, I don't blame China for everything that's happened. For example, China's in no way to blame for the idiots in Bristol, right? But I've just read a report that in Hubei province, officials have been told to be transparent about new cases, particularly in Wuhan, which still remains under quarantine. So, is that the Communist Party learning its lesson? Maybe. Maybe it's a way of sort of saying, oh, look, we are transparent. But it was covered up in the first place, and that comes from a culture of authoritarianism. But anyway, enough about the coronavirus. Well, I will say just one more thing. It's an interesting thought. Kind of occurred to me. On the eve of World War One in September 1914, British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey, Lord Grey, famously said the lights are going out all over Europe and we don't know when they will come back. That's not verbatim, but it was along those lines. Um, this was about the failed peace negotiations. Now, about a third of the world is now in lockdown. India, a country of 1.3 billion people, the world's fastest growing population, is in lockdown. So if we think it's extraordinary in this country, you can imagine what it's like in India with 1.3 billion people. Incredibly hard to enforce. And I had a bit of a debate recently with a friend from Vietnam over communism. Um, I have to say it was civil. We were very respectful to each other, but I stood by my guns insofar as I feel that communism is a system that can never be justified. I feel that communism, wherever there is a communist system, there will be a lack of transparency because the single party controls the media. It's always the way in every communist state. Well, the few of them that are still left, China, Vietnam, Laos, I think there's one or two others, but that's always the situation in communist states. Communist states do not tolerate other opinions. That's just the history. That's the fact. It's the record. And she was saying every country deals with things in their own way and so on. But it was a civil debate, but a lot of interesting points were raised. Um, but this kind of got me thinking about the issue of freedom in general. I am absolutely adamant that democratic societies will always be more free and will always be a superior system as a system to communism. Because, and this is the point I made to my friend, democracy will have flaws. We've seen that with the recent religious violence in India. You can pick out all manner of problems under democracies. You can pick out police brutality in the United States. You could pick out religious violence in India. You can pick out X, Y, and Z problems in the UK or France or any other democracy. Um, and one thing that's particularly come under debate in democracies in recent years is the nature of free speech and responsibility of words. And I certainly don't take for granted that we have absolute freedom of speech. I think it's a much, much better situation than a country like China where you can't criticize the government. We can openly criticize the government here, and we can, there's satire in newspapers of the government, of the royal family. That's sort of inconceivable in a country like China. But so the basic right to dissent is definitely there. However, we see with issues like transgender pronouns, we see some of the thought policing that is going on in universities. So we can't just take it as a given that people can say whatever they want. And this is where a caveat comes in. That is, where do you draw the line between controversial opinions and incitement to violence or, sorry, I just hit the laptop, incitement to violence or spreading hate? I was absolutely livid with the Labour Party for their expulsion of Sir Trevor Phillips for telling the truth. I thought that was a sinister move towards endorsing a sort of blasphemy law-like mentality, and I'm furious with Labour for doing that, although I'm also not particularly surprised by it. The context there is historic comments he'd made saying that there is a problem with Islam and Western values. And he had also spoken about the grooming gang. So for this, he had been accused of being Islamophobic and expelled from the Labour Party. Yet the things he said are verifiable, based on facts, based on things that we can verifiably look at. So basically, the man was punished for telling the truth. So I do not believe that Western societies are totalitarian. I do not believe that Western political systems are totalitarian, fundamentally, because I think the nature of our societies would never allow for that. Even if governments tried it, I think that people would not let that happen. I think the dynamic is there for totalitarianism to be contained. I would never say it could never happen. I think if there was inclinations of it happening, it would be contained. Do I believe this lockdown is totalitarian? Absolutely not. I think it's absolutely necessary. And our freedoms are not being restricted. This is a very important point to emphasize. We can still go out to get basic necessities. We can still exercise. We can still totally put out our views like I'm doing right now. So no one should kind of get into conspiracy theories that this is totalitarian. Boris Johnson is not a dictator, and this is not a totalitarian move. This is a common sense public health move. Some would say it's come too late. Some would actually say the government's been too lax on this, with maybe some justification for that claim. But when it comes to freedom, I would make this point. Absolute freedom doesn't exist in this world. So when we talk about freedom, particularly when we're talking about free states, the free world versus totalitarian states, we have to be a little bit careful not to send out the message that promoting democracy and promoting freedom means that's absolute freedom. Because then you get into a trap where people say, oh, but look, You don't have freedom to do that. You don't have you know, if absolute freedom existed, pedophiles would be allowed to look at child porn, right? But there's a very good reason why they don't, or why they're not allowed to, because it involves the abuse of children. It involves hurting other human beings. And the argument, oh, they're just looking, is flawed when you consider that there has to be a demand there, even if they don't act on it. I know there's this argument that not all pedophiles act on it. Well, there are different levels. Clearly, someone physically abusing a child isn't the same as someone looking at the material, but I would still argue looking at it is fueling the trade. That's why it's rightly dealt with harshly. It should be. Because if someone is looking at that material, even if they try to justify it to themselves, oh, I'm not doing it myself, they're taking sexual gratification from the abuse of real human beings. That's why it's not only abhorrent to most people, but it is dangerous. So this is why absolute freedom doesn't exist, because if it does, you could say anyone, if you take this to its absolute extreme, absolute freedom is for everyone, and anyone can do anything they like. You could go and masturbate in a public park. You could, well, absolute freedom equals the worst sort of anarchy because it just means a free for all where anyone does whatever they like, no responsibility, no care for other human beings, no sense of, just, it would be absolute dystopian chaos. So let's be very clear about that. Absolute freedom does not exist. And whilst I have enormous respect for human rights activists and I support them, people need to understand that when they're calling for freedom, when they're calling for liberty, they understand that there isn't what they're calling for is the right to dissent, the right to freedom of assembly. I'm talking about normal circumstances, not the situation we're in now, but normal circumstances. The right to assembly, the right to dissent. Um, so I think really freedom is about personal liberty with responsibility. And it's about, I don't want to say relative freedom because that sounds like it's downplaying the importance of what liberty is. But I would basically sum up freedom as liberty with responsibility. That's why when someone hurts society, their basic liberty is taken away through imprisonment. That doesn't mean the human rights have to be taken away. Taking away liberty isn't the same as taking away human rights. So, for example, if you kill someone, if you violently attack someone, if you rape someone, your liberty is taken away because you have hurt society. But that doesn't mean that you can't have food, medical attention, or exercise, or the due process that gives you a fair trial. I really think these things need to be understood. When it comes to freedom of speech, I would be an advocate of having the broadest definition possible, including the right to offend, or rather the freedom to offend. I'm not saying people should go out and offend for the sake of it. I do not. I'm very, very wary of criminal penalties for offensive words. Very wary of that. Let's say someone makes a racist video and they're making lazy generalizations and they're making racist comments. I think that can be grossly offensive. I think people would have the right to be angry about that. But if they are not expressing incitement to violence, like they're not saying, go out and kill these people because they're different from us, or they're not saying something that can really rationally be construed as a threat, then ultimately, I don't think that should be a criminal offence. I think that networks have a right to choose who they give a platform to. So if they say, we don't want those opinions on this platform, you're kicked off, I think that's totally reasonable. That's why, many groups on Facebook, the admins have rules with good reason. No profanity, no sexism, no racism, because they don't want their names associated with those sort of sentiments, and that's understandable. So when we come out with opinions, it comes with responsibility. I know full well if I say something out of anger, even if I believe that I'm right, there's responsibility there. So I'll give an example of this. I've got very strong views on crime, as people who follow this channel know. And I sometimes do admittedly feel very resentful towards some of our judges when I feel that they've been too lenient in serious cases, particularly with youth crime, particularly with gratuitous violence, and you see pathetically soft sentences. So I have been very harsh in my assessment of certain judges. Now, I think it's legitimate for me to say they're weak and useless. That's not polite, that's not pleasant, but that's genuinely how I feel. Now, if I extended that to say, oh, people should get revenge on these judges and go out and attack them, then I would be inciting violence, right? So that's where personal responsibility comes in. I think we can express anger, dislike, and resentment of people without inciting violence. And this has to be understood, and I believe it has to be allowed, particularly for public figures like politicians. That's why I'm a little bit wary when I hear, for example, politicians are being trolled by people. Well, if you're in politics, you need tough skin. Now, if someone's sending a death threat to a politician's family, that's a totally different thing. If they're sending death threats to the politician, that's a different thing. But if they're simply saying you're an effing idiot and your policies are appalling, or shame on you, your policies are killing people, or something like that, frankly, they just have to take that on the chin because they've the right to argue back and say, well, actually, you're wrong about this. My policies or my party's policies aren't doing that. I think, public figures have a right to defend themselves. I would argue that freedom should be the broadest definition possible, freedom of speech, short of threats and short of obvious bullying. I mean, if you have a group of kids who are picking on another kid, that's not freedom of speech, that is blatant bullying. But saying that you dislike a public figure, I don't consider that bullying because the public figure, especially a politician, they're making decisions that impact lives. So the public have to have the power to express dissent. And if that means angry dissent, so be it, so long as it's not threats. So, yeah, freedom is liberty with responsibility. And like I say, if you don't have responsibility, if you're threatening people, if you're hurting people, then that liberty is taken away. But that is not the same as depriving someone of their human rights. And I think that needs to be understood. Anyway, that's my take. Thank you for watching and hearing me talk. I do appreciate your time.